Well, for me, the core issue, well, there's sort of two, I don't know, it's okay, sorry, let's see. Okay, for me, the core issue is really the foundation the sport is built on. And that still has a long way to go. And what I mean by that is that the business foundation, the way teams are constructed, it's on a revenue model that depends entirely on sponsorship or donorship from from wealthy individuals or companies that want to come into the sport. And any one of these teams, if that sponsor chooses to go a different direction next year, or if the wealthy individual decides, he wants to buy a Formula One car instead or whatever, it ends. And it ends very quickly and abruptly. I've never seen another sport where the #1 ranked team in the world, HTC a few years ago, is non-existent the next year. And that fundamental hasn't changed. And what that does is it leads to a lot of people feeling insecure about their job, and not just the riders, but the staff of the teams, from stem to stern, feeling sort of, well, am I going to have a job next year or am I not? Is this organization going to exist next year or is it not? And that fundamentally has to change, because that affects everything. That affects the culture of anti-doping. If you have insecure people, doping can come into play very quickly, because all they're worried about is keeping their head above water. If you have security, it's easier to keep it under control. Across the board, it affects so many different issues. It affects athlete safety. It affects all these things where, when you've got sort of a desperate job environment, that you're unable to move the sport into a truly professional spot where the athletes are treated as the real hard men and heroes that they are, and that the teams and the fans have something long term to look toward. So that's got to change. And I haven't seen too much encouraging movement to that so far, but that's the core issue that needs to be looked at and dealt with. Well, listen, cycling's unique. I mean, it's a very, very unique sport on a lot of different levels. I mean, starting off with the fact that you're dealing with a team sport where an individual wins. So you have all these guys that completely sacrifice their own chances so that one guy can win. That right there sets it apart from everything else. Every other sport is the team wins or the individual wins, but you don't have a team sport where an individual wins. And sociologically, that makes it incredibly complex right off the bat. So sure, there are models, but I think you have to apply a little bit from this sport and a little bit from that sport and actually come up with something creative for the sport of cycling. Sure. I mean, I've got my ideas, but you have to put them on paper. I don't know if I can explain them to you. And I mean, it's a complex model for sure. I mean, if you want me to try, I'll give it a shot. But
that might be interesting. I mean, why not?
All right. Okay. Well, oh man, I'm going to get into a little bit of nerd speak here, but. So, basically, you have to look at sports leagues that are successful from an investor standpoint, an athlete standpoint, a fan standpoint, and look at why they are successful. Now, a lot of people would say, for example, the English Premier League, well, that's successful. I don't totally agree with that, because if you look at the business models there, you've got each of the teams carrying a lot of debt. That it's sort of almost like an arms race in who can buy the bigger players, and that there's just a lot of inflow of money, but it doesn't really seem like it's per se a solid investment. And again, that's exemplified by the fact that they're carrying a lot of debt. you could look at U.S. baseball and say, well, that's a successful sport. And I would say, is it? Because you have 2 or 3 teams that pretty much win the World Series every year, and it doesn't trickle down to the smaller teams very often. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, one being that the New York Yankees have a huge salary for their players, and a team like the Oakland A's or the Colorado Rockies have a very small salary base for their players. And so, you know, it's not financially fair, as it were. You know, you're playing chess, and one player gets 47 pieces and the other one gets 13. So who's going to win most of the time? So when I see a sports league that I do think is successful in the business front, and in certain ways cycling should use this sport as a model, and in other ways not, you know, especially the anti-doping front definitely should not use this sport as an example. But the NFL in the United States, you have all the teams are required basically to have the same salary. I mean, the players are enormously compensated, but everyone's starting out with the same number of pieces. The minimum salaries are very high relative to other sports, meaning that the guys doing the grunt work in the trenches, just like in cycling, they're well compensated, and that they're not that far from, you know, the big players. A small team can win in the NFL because, again, everyone's starting off with the same number of pieces. The Green Bay Packers, I mean, Green Bay is it's a small town that's not that economically robust, and yet they can be Super Bowl champions. The underdog can win. You look at the way they do the draft, you know, the worst team gets the first pick. So there's a constant equalization, and it puts a premium on coaching, tactics, strategy, fitness, all those things. It puts a premium on how you're going to win. Comes down to creativity and intelligence. And the willingness of your athletes to work hard. And that's, I think that's a pretty honorable model. It also gives the fans always something to cheer for because they know their team can win. It engages larger audiences because there's an increased competitiveness to each one of the games because everyone's starting out at the same basis. And then ownership, again, is very attractive. Because you don't have the arms race that's going on. It's not just spend more and more. No, it's if you invest in an NFL franchise, you know that if you get the best people around, you get the most intelligent, creative people around, you can win. And all of a sudden, it's not just pouring money down the pipe. It's actually a real investment. And that's something cycling, to me, desperately needs because it needs investors, not donors. And so that's sort of the way I see that. You know, those teams also, and this is the key part of it all, is that they're permanent franchises. Meaning that in cycling, you know, next year do I know that Garmin-Sharp is going to be in the World Tour? No, there's not a single team in pro cycling that absolutely has assurance that they're going to be in the World Tour next year. So how does that bode for longevity of the teams? How does that, fans, you know, how do they think of it? Their team may or may not be in the top league next year. Whereas, and especially investors, how are investors going to feel about that, knowing that the franchise that they put money into may or may not make the top league? That's a very difficult scenario for people who are investment minded to deal with. And, you know, in the NFL, you have these are the teams that play year in, year out, and there's value in that. Cycling, we need to create value in the teams. Right now, that doesn't exist, and that's a key component. Creating value is what creates that foundation that allows things to be built on a stable place, as opposed to being, you know, building a beautiful house built on quicksand. Yeah, very big difference. But, you know, the principles that I went through, they apply. You know, I don't think, can you sell tickets roadside to cycling? I don't think you should. I mean, that's one of the beauty of the sport, is that one of the things that's beautiful about the sport is that it's free. I don't think you should be selling tickets on the roadside. These are public roads, and people should be able to come out and enjoy the sport. And I feel like that's one of the attractive parts of the sport. So you know, I don't see ticket sale revenue as a you know, as a way forward. And everyone's talking about, you know, media rights sharing and so on, and television rights revenue. Well, those are all nice, but as opposed to constantly trying to build at the top end, and again getting into this arms race scenario, why don't we look at structuring it correctly? And I think that's far more important than finding new ways to grab money.